Hey there, and welcome back to FNAF in Real Time once again to cover a lot of the major errors that my story breakdown had, thanks to some clarifications made by the owner of the FNAF fan game wiki, Developing City, who has the story laid out thanks to their collaboration with Taryn, the one behind In Real Time's story. Now, I don't normally do this for story breakdowns, and I don't necessarily plan on doing them all the time, but my interpretation of In Real Time is quite different from what the actual game's story is, and I wanted to actually note those differences and actually make clear that my interpretation of the story is not actually what's happening. And part of the reason why I really want to do this is because a lot of my critiques on the game's story and its delivery was based on my interpretation. And since my interpretation is incorrect, right, the game's story and its critiques are also flawed as a result. Also, it should be noted that there's a lot more outside information that actually gives lore details on this game in particular, which I usually don't use. Essentially, when it comes to story breakdowns, I only rely on what the game itself tells you. I very rarely have exceptions to that rule. For example, in Real Time, I obviously use the Monitor series. But aside from that, I usually don't go outside of the game itself. Now, if I had relied on more of the available outside information, that would have helped me avoid some of the errors that I made. And of course, as a result of what happened with this game in particular, I might end up changing that. Though that's not to say that I plan on relying on the wiki like I am for this video, because if the wiki already lays out the story, then it's kind of a moot point for me to just repeat what the wiki tells you. I'm not here trying to rely on the wiki and then just regurgitate what the wiki says. That's why I usually rely on just the game itself, because I want to come to those conclusions based on what the game itself tells me rather than go through a wiki entry essentially. With that said, thanks to Developing City, the owner of the FNAF fan game wiki, for letting me know about these clarifications and these errors. I'll be using the wiki as a source from here on out for this game, as I pretty much mentioned and alluded to before. And with that said, let's get into it. Of course, before I can address any corrections, what was my interpretation of FNAF in Real Time's story? Essentially, I believed Donovan was investigating his daughter's disappearance/death as a child from back in 1985, which led him to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Now, what I mean is that I thought his daughter died in the 1985 missing children incident, then essentially 18 years later, he ends up at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where he has his night shift. So once he gets there in 2003, right, the strange events regarding the animatronics led him to contact a Fazbear location manager in Utah by the name of FNAF, who agreed to help him take down Fazbear Entertainment. Throughout the week, he learns that the animatronics are possessed by children thanks to Phone Guy, and then towards the end of the same week, as he's in communication with FNAF and everything, someone broke into his home, attacks him, and then erases all the evidence that he collected in his investigation. After Donovan's final shift, night 5, he would get to the front entrance before the purple man quickly approached him. This is essentially when Donovan dies, according to Phone Guy's tape recording that he left for Donovan, pretty much assuming that now Donovan is one of the spirits roaming the halls of the establishment. This would then lead to the game's first cutscene, where you can see Donovan speaking to Brother, believing that Brother is the one behind the kids' disappearances, including his own. Afterwards, he dies as indicated by the Phone Guy. Now, to a certain degree, some of this is still right. Donovan was indeed investigating his daughter's death, but not as a child. Apparently, Donovan's daughter is an adult. Not just any adult, but actually the night guard that we see die in Monitor Series Episode 3, aka the first commercial, where after the commercial you see this security guard running down the hallway under Freddy into the office and is then surrounded by the animatronics. Now this revelation irks me, because neither the game, or Monitor Series for that matter, implies that Donovan's daughter is an adult. Honestly, it suggests the opposite. From the note on Donovan's computer, which is literally a child's note, right? Saying that, "I love you, Dad, have a good time at your new job," or something along those lines. And then you have the Monitor Series, which literally depicts Donovan's daughter as a child standing next to Brother. Even the owner of the wiki came to this conclusion as well, but was then corrected by Taryn. So you can see why this revelation, a very important one, has a lot of cascading effects, because a lot of my interpretation of this game's story was dependent on the idea that Donovan's daughter was part of the missing children incident. But clearly that's not the case. Now, to be fair, there is a credit segment for Donovan's daughter in the commercial episodes for the Monitor series, but I assumed that was for the child laughter playing through the commercial. There was no real indication that she could have been the actual guard from episode 3. So, now that we know Donovan's daughter actually died as a night guard at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and not as a child, that pretty much unravels the idea of her possessing Brother. Now, with regards to Brother's death specifically, according to the song Born in 1987 by Real Time Studio, Brother actually dies in 1987, or rather, the child possessing Brother died in 1987, and that's when Brother was born. This line is actually shown in-game on the main menu, literally saying, "Why was I born in 1987?" Which again, should have been a little bit of a flag to me, saying, whoever Brother is being possessed by, they were possessing Brother in 1987, not in 1985, like my current interpretation would have assumed, right? Because obviously, if Donovan's daughter was possessing Brother and she died in 1985, technically Brother would be born in 1985. So definitely an error I should have caught, I think, but again, a bit shifty with how Donovan's daughter is represented in the game. Now, also important, the song reveals that whoever's possessing Brother was actually alive in 1983, right? So they did not die in 1983, they mainly did die in 1987, but I guess the reason for that distinction, importantly, is to signify that whoever is possessing Brother is not Michael's younger brother, aka Aton, right? Also, I should have made this part a lot clearer, because I don't really talk about it, but the one that Donovan makes contact with, that Utah Day Manager, FNAF, is indeed William Afton. We know, according to Donovan's first recording, that William Afton mysteriously died a few weeks before the missing children disappearances in 1985, which likely meant that he disappeared without a trace, right? Afton just up and disappeared and was probably presumed dead. Of course, Afton always had a knack for aliases and fake names. Literally, even the FNAF movie shows this, so that explains the ridiculous name that is FNAF, and he has a lot of motive for wanting to kill Donovan anyway for investigating Fazbear Entertainment. Now, I wasn't too off with this, because I did allude to the idea that FNAF, we don't know if he could be trusted, right? Especially with a fake name like that, but I never really drove this point home, which I think I should have. Now, one thing I do disagree with what the wiki says about Donovan's story is that Donovan apparently dies at his home during the recording tape number 2, right, where Donovan realizes someone followed me home. I don't think Donovan could have died here for obvious reason. Number 1, Night 5 happens. I'm not sure why, if Developing City is watching this, Night 5 is missing from the wiki. There's no mention of the minigame or Afton pulling up on Night 5 in his car, so that might be something you want to check out. So then this leads us to the duck minigame in the woods, which I interpreted it as symbolism for the death of Donovan's daughter. This is actually symbolizing Donovan's death. Essentially, William seems to hijack Donovan's soul and puts it in the duck suit. Now, I have to be honest, I don't like the wording of that interpretation, because it makes it seem like William literally grabs Donovan's soul and puts in the suit, when we know that's not what he really does. He puts the bodies in the suits, which leads to the souls possessing the suits, right? And so what I think is really happening here, or at least what I think should be happening here, is pretty much this is the moment of Donovan's death. Donovan, after Night 5, right? He encounters William, who attacks him, possibly left Donovan bleeding of some sort of major injury, which leads Donovan to run out into the woods, trying to find help, a campfire, a house, but there's no one there. It leads him to that lake. Once he enters the lake, for whatever reason, I don't know, but he enters that lake trying to escape William, and then we see the lake turning bloody, possibly due to his injuries. He starts to go slower and slower as he gets weaker and weaker from his injuries, and that's when William catches up to him and finishes the job. He then would have to bring Donovan's body to the restaurant once again and put him in that duck suit, where we then eventually lead to the beginning cutscene of this game. That to me makes a lot more sense than the idea of, or the wording rather, of Afton seizing Donovan's soul and putting it in the suit. So now, according to the wiki, a month passes after Donovan's death, which then leads us to the beginning cutscene where Donovan's stuck in that duck suit and he's talking to Brother. And after this, when you see Bonnie and Chica approach you, that's when they end up dismantling the suit and leaving the suit outside behind Freddy Fazbear's, which is the weird copper suit that Michael sees out back. That pretty much covers the ending of Donovan's story, right? He gets dismantled, that's the end for Donovan, and Michael's pretty much left picking up the pieces in a way. I do want to make a small note. I haven't mentioned any dates in this game, or in this video rather, because there seems to be a lot of confusion over when each thing or each event is taking place exactly. For example, the wiki claims that the first shift is actually on the 12th, which doesn't make sense at all given what the game tells you. The game suggests that the first night is actually on the 13th or the 14th. And that itself is a weird inconsistency because the FEC tool in the game suggests that night 1 has to take place on the 14th, because on the 16th it is night 3, or before night 4 rather. So that's how I got to the January 14th is night 1. However, the recordings that Donovan makes suggest that night 1 actually takes place on the 13th, because Donovan's first recording takes place on the 13th of January, which can only happen after night 1. This isn't too big of a deal, right? Especially in the grand scheme of things. The only thing it really affects is, when does Donovan recording number 2 happen? Does it happen after night 4 or after night 5? Obviously, in this case, I think it has to happen after night 4, because it doesn't make sense for it to happen after night 5, considering what we literally see in the minigame after night 5. For the most part, that covers a lot of the inconsistencies I had with regards to Donovan, except one. Who is the intruder in the trespassing tapes? It's actually Michael Afton. This frankly should have been a bit obvious to me, especially looking at how the game changes once Michael shows up before night 6. Part of the reason why I never considered Michael as the trespasser is because Michael's name never shows up in the Monitor series like voice acting credits. The only name that's ever mentioned is Donovan, and I guess relying on that too much kind of worked against me, because obviously, well, the truth is Michael's the one that trespasses, and it makes total sense. It actually solves one of the biggest issues I had with this game's story, or rather my interpretation of the story. After Donovan dies, Michael shows up about a year later, as we already know through the FEC, and all the animatronics are moving around, not really caring about him. I initially thought this was because it was daytime, but that's not exactly why. Remember episode 8 of the Monitor series? During the trespassing events, right, the animatronics were after Michael until he yelled wait. They stopped going after him, and after a bit, they just left him alone. This is because they realized that Michael did not look like the one that killed him. He didn't look like William, essentially. Now, Phone Guy alluded to this after night 3. The children were confused, lost, because they can't tell the difference between two guards wearing blue/purple uniforms. This was the explanation that Phone Guy gave to Donovan with regards to why his life was at stake. This was pretty much why Donovan was always being attacked during his night shift, and that's part of the reason why they attacked Michael as well, until they took a second and realized that he didn't look like the guard at all. It's also worth considering the fact that Michael is technically been here a decade ago during the events of FNAF 1, so the child spirits could have definitely just recognized him after waiting instead of just constantly attacking him, and then they ended up sparing him. Speaking of which, with regards to Michael, right, there is some speculation that Michael could be Phone Guy because of how similar they sound, but I'm not so sure of that. That's not enough evidence for me, especially considering that I initially thought the guy in the trespassing tape sounded a lot like Donovan, when in reality they're Michael. So it's not strong evidence, and the wiki doesn't allude to this possibility anyways. There's nothing to suggest that Phone Guy is Michael, though I suppose it is possible. So then that leads us to this. if Michael's the one that broke into Freddy's, that means that the event of the trespassing takes place in December 2003, almost a year after Donovan's death, which actually explains the change in the back room that I mentioned in my story breakdown. There is no spring Bonnie suit, no crowded supplies, just 2 arcade machines. If you saw my story breakdown video, then you know that I mentioned that you should take the Monitor series with a grain of salt, or be very speculative about it because of that weird inconsistency with the safe room. But now that has been resolved, so I think it's a lot more safer to trust the Monitor series in general, because that was like the one inconsistency that made me think, does the story in the Monitor series line up 1 for 1 with the game? And I think so far it does. Of course, all of this means that Michael is the one who hugs Brother towards the end of the trespassing tape. According to the wiki, this is mainly because of the compassion Michael has towards Brother. This could be due to him knowing the spirit who goes on to possess Brother, or maybe because Brother was holding the drawing of Donovan and his daughter. And if Michael knows about what happened to Donovan, maybe that's part of the reason why he kind of felt sorry for Brother, or maybe just felt compassion in general. I'm not too sure exactly, but that's kind of the general idea as to why the hug happened in the first place. Now, how does all of this fit with the ending of the game? The ending of the game, according to the wiki, is the result of Michael abandoning Brother and the animatronics, leaving the establishment. This is pretty much happening a few months after he arrives. If you take a look at the FEC tool, I believe during night 7, it's the end of April, I believe, which is when night 7 takes place. Brother said in his final monologue that there is no one left to save them and no one left to save, and I think that first part is in reference to Michael, whereas the second part is in reference to Golden Freddy. No one left to save because Golden Freddy is not really wanting to be saved. They want vengeance. They don't care about finding peace. They want to get vengeance against the one that killed them. So that second part is kind of for Golden Freddy, but the first part is in reference to Michael. Now I say this because according to the wiki, that minigame where Brother was putting up drawings pretty much symbolized Brother attempting to find someone who was worthy of saving the children. Now, to be honest, I find this part a little iffy because I don't know how you come to that conclusion personally. I mean, if there was a way to take a look at the drawings, right, and actually see what's being shown on them instead of just the pixelated versions, then I could definitely buy that a lot better. But because we only collect the drawings and that's it, it doesn't really hold much water, but I'll take the word of the wiki for this one. Now, taking that idea, right, that the drawings are meant for the person that's supposed to save the children, Michael is the only one who can collect all of the drawings, because the only way you get enough money is by completing night 6 along with the challenge nights, and only Michael can do that, obviously, because by that point Donovan's already dead. So if Michael's the one that's supposed to save them, but then leaves before doing so, abandoning them, that fits with Brother saying there is no one left to save them. I think a lot of this has to do as well with how Brother was talking about change. I think at one point Brother thought that he could be the one to save the animatronics, but then realized that he himself was not able to do so. Someone else had to be the one to fill that role. As a result, they all die out, and Golden Freddy lingers on, hungry for vengeance against the one that killed them. So that pretty much covers the intended story of FNAF in real time. Definitely different from what I thought, especially given I titled my story breakdown A Fatal Family Reunion, which isn't at all what happens, but frankly, I still like that interpretation because I think it's definitely an interesting alternate universe idea of what could have happened in this game. However, with that said, this interpretation of the story actually resolves a lot of the issues I had with my interpretation, right? Like the big inconsistency between the beginning cutscene and the Night 5 minigame is now resolved. Brother simply thought Donovan was the bad guy, which is why they dismantled his suit, but they never really put him in the suit, it was all William. Now, William Afton being PHNAF is something I should have covered more. I think at first I was hesitant to say that PHNAF was likely William because I kept forgetting to treat this game as a sequel story, right? A story that takes place after FNAF 1, but it's also trying to be a FNAF remake at the same time, which again, it's kind of weird to get used to. I don't know, because like part of my brain is like, remember, this is like a game remake but a story sequel. That's partially why I never mentioned William's name much if at all, in my story breakdown. Of course, the biggest issue I have with this interpretation still is Donovan's daughter being an adult. That part was not communicated properly at all in this game, and it had a cascading impact on my own interpretation of the game's story. With that said though, this story was definitely delivered more thoroughly than I initially gave it credit for. There were quite a few incorrect details that frankly I should have caught on more easily. For example, the trespassing videos being shown after night 5 should have made it clear to me that the trespassing happened after night 5. I treated the other cutscenes similarly, so I don't really know why I didn't do that for this one, so that's an error on my part. So now we conclude what actually happened in FNAF in real time. This started with Donovan's daughter, a night guard at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. She had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, likely presumed dead. This led to Donovan's investigation, involving a location manager known as FNAF. He's definitely realized something's wrong here. The robots are acting off, and you start collecting evidence. Phone Guy reveals the truth behind the robots: they're really possessed by children. You continue to make your plan with FNAF until one night he finds her home, breaks in, and attacks you, and proceeds to delete the evidence that you've collected thus far. In fact, this story actually makes a lot more sense now from the evidence standpoint. All the evidence files are videos from June 2002 to January 2003, which are probably recordings from when your daughter was working at Freddy's, and even past her disappearance. Because at first that was something that I couldn't quite understand. Why did we have videos from the last half of the year? Right? That part didn't make much sense to me, especially since I was thinking daughter died in 1985. Why are we looking at, half-a-year-old tapes? Of course, after night 4, you work one last night until a car pulls up. As you make your way to the entrance, you run into FNAF, who has other plans for you. Of course, Donovan dies, and Phone Guy leaves a message for his spirit, who eventually gets placed in the duck suit by Aton. Brother and the others think that you are the real perpetrator behind their deaths, so they dismantle you and leave you to rot outside behind Freddy Fazbear's. Michael then shows up a year later, hearing about another guard's disappearance at Freddy's. That leads to him breaking into the establishment and finding Brother. After a few months though, he leaves, unable to find William, his father, and Brother, along with the other spirits, eventually die out, leaving Golden Freddy and his vengeance to quietly burn. Overall, definitely a more sensible and fitting interpretation compared to my original one. However, I still think it's interesting to think of a world where my interpretation is what actually happened, right? Where Donovan's daughter was somehow Brother, right? And goes on to trap her own father in a duck suit. Definitely a very weird interpretation, right? A very, dramatic one, to say the least. But I think having that different perspective is definitely interesting. But of course, with all that said, that has been the true story, from what I understand now, behind FNAF in real-time story. Thank you once again to Developing City, the FNAF fan game wiki owner, for clearing up a lot of these details. Some of the details in the wiki I kind of disagree with in terms of how it makes sense and what the game actually shows you, but for the most part I think this interpretation of the story should be a lot more accurate now. I don't think I missed out on any major details for the most part, because the main important details that I got wrong was the trespassing, whoever the intruder was in the trespassing tapes. We covered that Donovan's daughter does not in fact possess Brother and was actually an adult when she died because she's the night guard. I don't think I had any other major misinterpretations, because the whole Donovan's daughter thing kind of resolved the duck minigame. It also resolves the interaction between Donovan and Brother. So I think for the most part I covered the major errors. So this is more like a hybrid story really between Donovan and Michael. More so Donovan, but Michael does have a more important role in this interpretation, which I'm honestly glad, because I felt like Michael in my original story breakdown felt like a weird add-on in a way, but here it makes a lot more sense now. But of course, with all that said, I hope you did enjoy. If you did, leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Lets me know you're enjoying the content and want to see more of it. If you haven't seen my original story breakdown, the link will be in the description below. It offers a definitely incorrect but different perspective on the game's story. So if you're interested in seeing what that's like, if you haven't seen it already, it'll be in the description. And with that said, I'll see you in another video. Take care.